This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
Today on the Restituto Orbis channel, we examine the account of the Victorian workhouses, or as we posit they are, the reset labor camps. As we fly over the Thames in London, we see the wondrous Tower Bridge of London, oftentimes mistaken for London Bridge, although there's a vast visual difference. This is another great product of the 1800s. And indeed, we're going to be focused on yet another institution of the 1800s, the Victorian workhouses. We have to go back to the origin concerning famines and plague. We're informed that the origins of the workhouse started in 1388. The effects of the Black Death, which had occurred decades earlier, resulted in a labor shortage and a subsequent act for the relief of the poor. So it's one of these accounts where we have a policy that's in place for hundreds of years and yet still affects the population in the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, or England as it was known during those years. We begin by examining the series of famines that occurred in the 1300s. There was a great famine and there were numerous famines. This weakened the population, a population that was focused on agrarianism, or bringing the harvest in from the fields. In the feudal enterprises at the time, they required serfs to bring in the harvest. We also had a 100 Years' War going on between England and France, and the war was allegedly paused because of the effects of the bubonic plague. Due to the weakness of these famines, the population was susceptible to the bubonic plague brought in by the fleas that rode on the rats. At least that's what history tells us, and many people were dying. People were dying in horrifying ways. The population of France decreased by 50%. The population of England at the time decreased by 20 to 30%. So you can see there was a disparity in how they were hit. This had grand social effects, and yet at the same time we're told that while it had great social effects, it wasn't until 1388 that they prevented laborers from moving around in England because there was a labor shortage. And they got right back to going with the war because, you need to get back to a war. And a plague and famine isn't going to stop a war. You also have the Poor Relief Act of 1601, and this is where we're told the first workhouses were established. We had the Great London Fire in 1666, and then after that, that brought us to the very questionable time of the 1800s. We started with the Industrial Revolution, which supposedly changed the nature of jobs, providing different jobs in different areas and bringing people off the farms. We had the Napoleonic conflicts that started the 1800s, or the Napoleonic Wars, and we've looked at these in detail before. And once these ended with the Industrial Revolution, we had many people wondering about the land, and now we look at the workhouses. And so here was the issue. You had labor laws that prevented people from moving from one county or one shire or one parish to another, and you had more people than you had work. So there were a lot of poor people. It should be noted, though, that the workhouses were for everybody. Orphans, the elderly, and even prime working age people seemed to end up there. What we're informed is that the workhouses were established so the state did not have to provide dispensation for these people. And there was supposedly a distinction made between able-bodied people who could work and idlers, or people who were able-bodied who opted not to work. The workhouses, we're told, were the Victorian era's answer for this. And so what they did was they had a design for these, although when you actually look at many of these workhouses that remain to this day, you'll notice that they are varied old world buildings, which seem to be many different designs. There's also the disturbing element that these workhouses seem to function as a place to incarcerate people. Indeed, many of the accounts at the time, such as from Charles Dickens' novel Oliver Twist, told us about how the workhouses function. The people who were there were fed and worked in very poor and harsh conditions, and they were kept away from the rest of society. They were given special uniforms to wear, so they couldn't really leave the workhouses. And if you look at how the workhouses were actually facilitated or run, they were operated much like prisons. Now, this is the mainstream account saying this. This is not some alternative history account. It is well known and well documented that these places were quite terrible. They were horrible. You will see those adjectives used frequently. The fact that forced child labor was a fact of life within the workhouses, or the elderly being forced to work, beyond just simply being a greeter at your favorite retail store. And while it may seem like it's a bit of a comical element, we have to consider that there were many unfortunate children that were taken away from their families. Children separated from their families, spouses separated from one another. The same practices that we saw when it came to the asylums. And there were also asylums operating at this time. So many different institutions, and yet it conflicts with what we're told about the fact that the great nations of Great Britain, England, the United Kingdom as it evolved, and then of course the colonies in the United States, that they cared about people, and yet they didn't have funding to provide these many institutions, yet somehow they were able to do it. The official story tells us that in Great Britain, that they delegated the care for the poor down to the parish level, and yet all these parishes constructed these workhouses. We're told that there was a template or a design for the workhouses, much as we're told there was a design for, say, the Kirkbride Asylums, which, while it emanated in the United States, somehow it spread across the land. So, very, very odd series of conflicting accounts, and consider many of the horrors that occurred in the workhouses. You had long working hours, you had total control, people weren't allowed to drink, people weren't allowed to celebrate Christmas, at least until the later years of the workhouses, and there's conflicting accounts about that. During the many famines, which also afflicted areas around the Great British Empire during the 1800s, and we're not exactly sure how that happened, you had many people that sought emergency relief at the workhouses. In Ireland and Scotland, they called these places the poorhouses. And here you can see an example of one of the alleged designs of these residences, or residences for the poor, as they euphemistically called them at the time. And again, you can see that there is a vast disparity in the buildings. This is Patrick Colquhoun. He was a Scottish merchant and statistician, and he was quite in favor of the workhouses. In fact, he said that poverty is necessary and it's indispensable, lest someone like him actually have to work. There were contemporaries, though, that said that his remedies caused more evils than problems they solved, so perhaps Patrick Colquhoun would make a very effective modern politician. No wonder Scotland was all about signing those treaties of union, because then they could have their own people put in poorhouses, which is what they called workhouses in Scotland and Ireland, interestingly enough. So they still had this same model of these very well-constructed and well-built poorhouses, workhouses, or all the other names that we have for these places that somehow just seem to end up having people incarcerated at them. And the reason for this being was that they needed to give them jobs. They needed to provide them a means of existence. That's what the official story says. And you can also find other accounts of very cramped conditions, and these seem to vary. Although some people might argue that this doesn't look any more cramped than any military bay or barracks. You can find an example, though, of the rules and the orders, which do seem to have a bit of a military nature to them. Everyone will do as the master or mistress of the house tells them to do, that they have to be in bed by a certain amount of time and be up by a certain amount of time. Everybody has to work. Anyone found guilty of really anything will be punished by the utmost severity of the law, and that always seems to be the way things are. We do have subsequent accounts that they tended to loosen up the nature of these places once the works of Charles Dickens and other contemporaries made it aware to the population of how much people were suffering in these workhouses. There's also a conflicting account of how many people in the United Kingdom today actually have genetic connections with people who went through the workhouses. We're informed currently by the mainstream that about 10% of the population in the United Kingdom has a genetic connection to the people that went through these workhouses. It's difficult to say, though, the exact numbers of the population. I always found it fascinating that we knew the exact numbers for life expectancy even during the bubonic plague. We're informed that prior to the bubonic plague, when it hit England in the 1300s, the life expectancy was 29.2 years. And then after the bubonic plague hit, it was lowered to 17.4 years. Very precise numbers. Who exactly was keeping track of these numbers, especially during a time when we're told that they had to rely on census data from when the Normans conquered England? You'll find many images of these workhouses where you see numerous individuals. We have many pictures of the elderly. We have many pictures of children who are all eating as though they're in some sort of military organization in a giant bay. We also have many different diagrams and supposed designs for these workhouses, although one would expect they would be standardized. Of course, that's easy to explain through the mainstream, because we can simply state that because the running and the construction of these workhouses were delegated down to the parish level, it really depended on if there were local benefactors who would build them, so I suppose it makes sense. Yet every single time, and the fact that many of these workhouses survive to this day, we can conclude that they were very well constructed with the finest means available at the time. Here you'll see what was supposed to be one of the design templates for the workhouses, more of the Y-shaped pattern or separate yards. Now, I'm not going to say that this looks like a prison, it just happens to resemble the layout of a prison. I'm sure it's a coincidence. But of course, none of the workhouses seem to share many features that you would expect in something that was designed and built by a contractor. And so we have a similar account to the Kirkbride Asylums, although it's safe to say that there's a lot more consistency observed in the Kirkbride Asylums. So again, that points to the fact that the workhouses definitely seem to be something that was operated more at the local level, and yet they still seem to have some sort of national government guidance behind them. There's the unfortunate account of what was happening in Ireland with the Great Potato Famine that occurred during the middle of the Victorian era. And for those not familiar, the Victorian era was considered during the reign of Queen Victoria. And while it does not include all of the 1800s, it includes most of the 1800s. And it certainly includes the high tide, if you will, of the Great British Empire. Of course, one thing that doesn't tend to be mentioned with the Great British Empire were all the famines that occurred in India and the potato famine in Ireland. But that's not any sort of concerted effort by the government to cause these famines. It was just due to a lack of action or perhaps poor decisions that caused the deaths of many people. We know that it's not going to be called genocide, and we're assured by many historians it was not a deliberate genocide. It was just some unfortunate decisions that led to the death of millions, sort of like the Napoleonic Wars. Looking closer, though, at the workhouses, we start to realize that they did seem to have a very different function. And despite the fact that people were aware of how terrible and horrible these places were and all the deprivations that those that were forced to reside in the workhouses endured for decades or their entire lives, were informed that the children that went through these workhouses did not receive proper educations, and therefore they were unable to ever escape this cycle that they were stuck in of poverty. Now, this is what the official mainstream account tells us, that these workhouses were established because somebody had to care for the impoverished, and yet there was a concern from the state that people such as you're seeing in this image were idlers, that they were able-bodied but they simply were too lazy to work. And as our good friend from Scotland said earlier, he needs people to work so he can have an easier life. Again, I'm just reflecting the mainstream account. I'm not making any judgments. But you can see how cramped quarters were in these workhouses, and this certainly looks a lot more cramped than you'll see even any military bay appearing. So it's hard to say exactly what was happening. But what can we conclude that these workhouses really represented? If these were contemporaneous with the asylums as we're told that they were, and we consider an alternative perspective of what was really going on, if you have a series of conflicts that are going on across the entire land, or dare I say a worldwide conflict, in which you're destroying the enclaves of a previous civilization, you have many survivors. You have many people that are taken prisoner. Entire groups of people, whole populations that were told in the 1800s were relocated. And where were they relocated to? There's a very interesting special relationship that the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the United States have always had, even though in the very incipients of the United States we're told that it was a revolution to break free from the influence of the British monarchy, and yet then this special relationship was established. And so if all of these people were being brought from across the British Empire and across the nascent American colonies at that time to certain reception points, large ports of call, then perhaps they were bringing all these people in to be reprocessed in this new civilization. Or maybe it was just the fact that there were still many people from this previous civilization that were still across the land. In the United States, they called them Native Americans, and in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, England, they simply called them the poor. Because really, if you have no way to document or verify anything, you can pretty much say whatever you want. Now, granted, that's a rather extreme assertion and a rather extreme hypothesis, especially if you're a fan of the mainstream account. You certainly can't disprove it, although you can't really prove anything because, unfortunately, there are no first-hand sources left who can tell us exactly what happened in the 1800s. Indeed, there is nobody alive now who can tell us what happened in 1899 even. Whatever truly happened, though, this left a psychological scar on many people. There are people to this day that you can talk to who have experiences of the workhouses, or at least a collective memory of it, passed down by their family. And they talked about what a horrifying experience it was, such as this example of a prison ship, the hulk of a slope that was originally in the Royal Navy that was converted to be a prison ship. Imagine being forced to endure these cramped conditions and live in decaying wood during that time. And then you have the images and pay attention to what you see in the expression of the faces of these people. We know what these images are from, and we know what we call these places today, where people wear uniforms and they are processed and they are forced to do labor. We have many different names for it. Yet, looking at what remains of the workhouses, we do see a very elaborate architecture. And there's also the fact that many of them are still standing in perfect condition to this day. Now, when the United Kingdom finally went away from the workhouses in the 1920s, 1930s after reform was finally established and we're told that care for the poor went back officially to the government, then many of these facilities were, much like the asylums, converted into hospitals and other institutions and dividing up care for the poor. Indeed, we can see some of these accounts at the time from the 1800s that showed how the poor did not even have enough to eat, at least the people that they referred to as the poor, or perhaps labeled as the poor, picking the bones to live. There's also the type of work that they were doing. It seems to be very monotonous work. We're informed that they crushed the bones of animals to create fertilizer, and later accounts even state that they were crushing the bones of animals to create roads. Very interesting accounts. And the United States had its own workhouses as well. Yes, the land of opportunity, the land of so many millionaires, as some people have told me in comments on other videos, that there were just millionaires everywhere in the United States, St. Louis, Kansas City. But they had workhouses, or poor farms, or poorhouses as they called them in the United States. Indeed, here in Iowa, they had a poor farm. Why or how would you need a poor farm in the 1800s in Iowa when you're literally giving land away? Or you have 10% of the population that needed to go fight a civil war? And after that, you still had the Native American conflicts to engage in. But these poor houses or these poor farms did really exist in Iowa. They are very well documented. So again, this is another element of this relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States which exists to this day. Who knows, perhaps there's a little bit more to the Atlantic Charter than we realize. Perhaps it was in existence far longer than we know of. And again, you can find the same mix of old world buildings with these poor houses, these poor farms in the United States. Some impressive architecture. And every single state, much as they document their mental asylums in the United States, also documents the attempt to deal with poverty. And so it seems to be yet another layer, another institution that's designed to incarcerate people. Because that's really how these places functioned. Now, of course, officially you would understand that once you manage to achieve work on your own, or you were able to get a job, perhaps you could escape the cycle of being, how shall we say, a guest of these places. And here in Kansas City, they didn't have a workhouse, they actually had a work castle that was constructed in the later portion of the 1800s. Yes, a work castle. It makes total sense, doesn't it? This structure is still standing to this day, although it seems to have become a canvas for the Bob Ross version of graffiti. It's still rather intriguing that they decided to build a castle in Kansas City for the workhouse, or the work castle, because I guess you need the finest structure so you can house the people that are going to be working, who are poor. It only makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And naturally they have these postcards that show how wondrous the structure is. And it still stands to this day in Kansas City. A castle that was constructed for the poor, so they could work there. I suppose that makes a lot of sense, especially when you have millionaires all over the place. So, prison for paupers, that seems to be what the workhouses were for. But what was their true purpose? What was really going on at this time frame? We have to look at the grander scale of events, and we consider the reset war that was occurring in the 1800s. After the reset from the 4th to the 5th era, we have numerous peoples who were across the land. Officially, the Circassians were an ethnic group from the Northwest Caucasus, an area that seems to come up in our explorations a lot, especially with Alexander the Great. These people were, unfortunately, in the way of Russian expansion, at least that's what official history tells us. And they had a very honorable military tradition and some rather unique styles of dress and clothing that were allegedly adopted by Russian military units after this conflict. In the 1860s, after decades of conflict, there was a forced relocation of these Circassians out of the Northwest Caucasus areas, and you can see that many of their styles of dress are quite intriguing and almost seem to be something from a fantasy land in many different ways, and yet we're told that these were just a group of people that were in the mountains and were simply, unfortunately, in the way of Russian expansion or settling of the Caucasus or the east side of the Black Sea. Very odd series of accounts, and yet we notice that this relocation of people matches another account that was going on in the United States at the same time. And we can see that there were numerous commanders in the Russian army who were told employed policies of total destruction. And oddly enough, it matched many of the policies of destruction that we saw going on at the exact same time in the United States when it came to how they were dealing with the Native Americans that were also, unfortunately, in the way of expansion. Again, this is according to the mainstream account. But could there have been a much more deeper story behind this, such as Tsar Alexander II, a contemporary of Abraham Lincoln, who even sent warships to help the Union during the United States Civil War? Oddly enough, Sochi, where that strange 2014 Olympics opening ceremony occurred, was in the land that was inhabited by the Circassian people. So many strange accounts and strange coincidences. But it's one of those accounts from the 1800s of the forced relocation. It's considered debatable what the true aim of these actions were. Some people call it genocide, some simply call it government policy to ensure that a government achieved its end. Which is when we consider the account of the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of the Cherokee from Georgia, Alabama, the Seminoles from Florida, and numerous conflicts. We're told that this was a very terrifying event and that in many ways it was a great crime perpetuated by the United States against these Native peoples, and that's what the mainstream account says. But is that just to simply conceal the fact that there was a lot more going on? There was also the Great Sioux War that happened after the United States Civil War. The United States showed how morally correct it was by ending slavery, and then followed that up by continuing their expansion against the Sioux. And we have George Armstrong Custer, a famous military officer, who bears more than a striking resemblance in his younger days to actor Sean Penn, I'm not sure why. And yet we have similar looking images of officers just relaxing or luxuriating wherever they are, and are they really in a conflict, or are they just having a good time? Of course, we can justify that by saying the photographers only took pictures when they were relaxing. And of course, we have the very elaborate facial hair, whether it was Custer or General Crook, and their campaigns that were directed by Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, the Great Sioux War. We even have pictures of some of the Lakota leaders, Sitting Bull and Red Cloud. Red Cloud even met with Ulysses S. Grant, and they talked about the division of land. Nelson A. Miles, a U.S. Army officer who led the Great Victory. Most of the battles that the U.S. Army had with Native Americans ended in terrifying defeat for the United States Army. Great tactical defeats. Indeed, the entire regular United States Army was destroyed in the Northwest Indian War after the Revolutionary War. We even have accounts of an entire genocide going on in California, and we can look at the Native American population in California, how it went from 300,000 to under 25,000 by 1910. And that gives us the impression that there was unfortunately a death of many Native Americans that were occurring, but we'll be assured and reassured by modern authorities and historians that this was not an intentional genocide. Let's look at these conflicts, the Napoleonic conflict, the Circassian conflict, and the Native American conflicts. And we see that in the Napoleon Wars, 6 million people died. In the Native American conflicts that lasted for 100 years, supposedly, 4.7 million Native Americans died. It was probably many more, but that's a decrease of the population. And then on the high side of the Circassian relocation from the Caucasus to what's now Turkey, 2 million people died. Well, guess which one of these they actually call a genocide? I suppose the Napoleonic Wars, you can say that 6 million people died in the conduct of war, and they were incidental death. It was not an intentional attempt to destroy a nation or an ethnic group. It just happened to have the most number of people that died. As for the Native American wars that occurred in the United States at the time, we don't really know what the original Native American population was. We're told it goes anywhere from 1 to 10 million. That's quite a variance. Back to what we were talking about with workhouses. If you had all these conflicts that were going on across the land in the 1800s, whether it was the Mexican War, which oddly enough the United States Army suddenly expanded to a size of 100,000 when it had never been large before, and then that was quickly exceeded by the Civil War where they had armies that were larger than that. You have the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which supposedly brought the emperor back. You also had the Great Potato Famine occurring in Ireland. All these events occurring at the same time in the 1800s. And then strange international expeditions that were sent to China, where you supposedly had 8 nations operating together to put down the Boxer Rebellion. And oddly enough, when you look at certain images, their uniforms do seem to look rather alike. But perhaps that's just all a great coincidence. What was really going on with all these conflicts? It seems to me that this was an effort to destroy the enclaves or the survivors of any people that would not go along with the new order that existed after the reset. And what it all comes down to in summary is that both the asylums and the workhouses and the large factories were all established as relocation centers, places to send these people who would not reintegrate into the new society, what had come after the reset. And therefore you could keep these people at the workhouses, you could keep them at the asylums, and keep them out of the way of the new population. And you can see that with child labor and many of these other terrors that they do acknowledge now, that their purposes and their intentions were indeed achieved. We have many images that show us that slums did exist in these areas at this time, and yet these slums always seem to be centered around old world buildings. So we have the concept of prison for paupers, the workhouses in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the United States, contemporaneous at the same time. And we know that children, orphans, were separated from their parents, families were separated, people of all ages were sent to the workhouses. They were separated, they were forced to work, and for the most part they were imprisoned there for the rest of their lives. Indeed, that's what the mainstream tells us. We also have the mental asylums all across the land, where people were sent to who didn't really seem to integrate with society, or were not fitting in with the new Fifth Era civilization. So it seemed you had two choices. You either faced indoctrination or incarceration. You either went along with where things were going, or you were incarcerated. And it seems as though that was an incarceration sentence that would last for the rest of your life. So you could start off as a baby, and then spend the rest of your life in one of these workhouses, if you're lucky. It seems as though the asylums were actually a level below the workhouses for the people who were actively trying to prevent what was happening with the forces of the reset. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into orphan trains, completing the reset. The objective of today's exploration is to consider the role the orphan trains played in the last reset. New viewers of the channel may not be familiar with the 5 eras theory. The channel has several theories for the existence of the Old World and Tartaria, and this is one of the theories that we consider the most plausible, the 5 eras theory. Breaking down the entirety of human existence into 5 distinct eras that were separated by hard resets. The Golden Age comprising the first 3 eras, and then the Tartarian Age, or the age that preceded ours, whatever you want to call it, the civilization that we believe was across all the lands that came before us. Then we had a hard reset, and the year on that hard reset we debate. Was it 1850, 1800, and 1750? And that brought us into our contemporary age, or the current time frame that we have many unique and creative names for, such as the age of plastic, the age of disposability, and the age of many different alluring historical narratives. What we're looking at here, though, is the time frame immediately following 1850, which is when we believe the last reset occurred. And we're going to look specifically at how that reset was implemented. It looks like there were 3 distinct approaches that were used: conflict, assimilation, indoctrination, and typically in that chronological order. And in fact, even to this day, we see conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. The 19th century was rife with conflict, to include the United States Civil War, the Crimean War, and yet you can look and see many other conflicts. After conflict, which seemed to be targeting the remnants of the enclave population, the survivors of the previous civilization, we had assimilation, and that was where everyone found their proper roles in this new civilization after the reset. And then finally you had indoctrination. And indoctrination was ensuring that people had the proper thoughts and that they would never question what had happened. We have many pictures from this time frame that tend to pose more questions than they answer, as though there was some sort of strange massive expedition that was going on across all the lands to pacify what remained of a population. Now, we're told that these are legitimate conflicts, and the historical narrative tells us there was a civil war going on in the United States, there was the Crimean War going on, and so many other conflicts that you can look up yourself that completely dot the landscape of the 19th century, or the timescape as it were as well. It's an intriguing consideration, and yet we see other signs of it that show that there may be much more going on than we're aware in the historical narrative. The United States Civil War is often examined because of the conflicting accounts that we have in what occurred in the Civil War. Oftentimes we have pictures that don't match the narrative that we're given, or create more questions than they answer. For example, we're told time and time again that the United States military, or the Union, was segregated during the Civil War, and yet you see many different pictures that paint a different narrative. Now, were these pictures that were taken for purposes of displaying the political message at that time? And could they have been supporting the war effort as we were told in the historical narrative? Of course. However, there's just too many of them to simply ignore. And we have to wonder if there was something much greater going on, and that the nature of the conflict, and there's no doubt there was a very significant conflict that occurred, and not just in the United States and in the United States Civil War, but in all these conflicts across all the lands. We have to wonder what the true objective of the conflict is. And one of the channel's primary theories is that this conflict was targeting the remnants of the enclave population that had survived the last reset. People that they knew that were not going to go along with the reset and not drop what the truth was in favor of a new historical narrative. We have strange pictures like this that are supposedly from the United States Civil War, where we see large rabbles of people. We'll be told that this is some sort of formation for a militia. But when you look at this image, does this really give you the inclination that this is a militia? Or is there something else going on here? And we have the strange individual there with the top hat. This doesn't appear to be a military formation. It's very odd. You could have any kind of explanation for this photo. Is this a group of refugees going somewhere? Is this a group of people that are being moved from point A to point B against their will? None of the faces look particularly happy. This doesn't look like a group of people that are a militia, or they're going off to defend their homeland against some existential threat. We also think about the role that asylums played in the assimilation and indoctrination aspect of the conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. Earlier, the channel theorized the goals of the Kirkbride Plan, which was the plan behind asylums in the United States, but there were asylums across all the lands to ensure the population adhered to the reset. This was their way to ensure that people properly assimilated and they were indoctrinated. And if they were not, they were sent to the asylum, where they would live out their lives. It also supported the dual purpose of being able to explain the presence of isolated large facilities that didn't make sense. We even had special soldier asylums for soldiers who may have served in this conflict of suppressing the enclaves that remained from the previous civilization, and they were unwilling to accept the narrative that they were given after the conflicts were completed. So they had special asylums to send them off as well too. Now again, this is a theory. This could well be that it's just the historical narrative as we're told. But there's far too much evidence and far too many conflicts in the story to simply ignore it. And now we have to look at how the orphan trains played a role in this. We're given many accounts that there were just simply roving bands of children, especially in New York City. And we're told that this was because there were many children born out of wedlock. This is an interesting account because at the same time we're also told that culture in the United States was very different. That religion played a large role, and morality played a role within the family. We have to wonder when we see these kind of images, did these children really come from out of wedlock? Or were they the survivors, the remaining children of the families whose parents were killed in the conflict? Those families that were the final survivors of the previous civilization who refused to recognize the authority of the new civilization after the reset. It's a very intriguing premise, and we have to wonder, was that their story? We consider the concepts of diaspora and dysphoria. Diaspora being the concept of spreading a people from their homeland and removing their identity, and dysphoria, taking away their sense of adventure in life. Children without homes. It's a very noble aspiration. It's very altruistic. We're told that these children were simply compiled in New York City and that there were so many of them in roving bands that they didn't have their parents and they were simply orphans and they needed to be cared for. They needed to have families. So you can look up the grand plan that we had in our official historical narrative that there was simply a religious figure, a young minister named Charles Loring Brace, who became concerned with the plight of these street children and enacted a plan to where they were going to be transferred to states and families where they could be given wondrous families. Interestingly enough, the numbers that we have for how many were victims of this plan, or perhaps we should say those who benefited from the plan, because that's what we'll be told by the historical narrative, we have to wonder, what was the true number? We're told it was 250,000, but how many was it really? Numbers are always something that seems to be up for debate, and even our casualty figures from the United States Civil War seems to be a very fluid number. That varies depending on what. Of course, we discuss the altruistic nature of this endeavor, and it seems like it's something benevolent and would serve a good purpose. Although it should be noted that the transportation of children away from their parents is something that's occurred time and time again. For example, in World War II during the Blitz of London, where we have children that were taken away from their parents and sent away, ostensibly for their safety. In fact, the film The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe begins in this manner, where the children are taken away to escape the bombing. It's a very mainstream image that reminds us of what happened in the past. It also reminds us that this approach continues, this approach of seeming to want to separate families. Is it something that merely occurs because of events beyond our control? Or is it something much more insidious? Part of a planned, controlled narrative in which we attempt to attack every aspect of an individual's identity. And we start with the most basic, with the family. We look at the images and the concept of the orphan train going back to the United States, and we're told that its success depended on the altruistic nature, the generosity of the farmers, and the mercantilists that these children were being taken to. It's an interesting prospect in the fact that these children were supposedly part of roving bands in New York City, or that they were simply overwhelming the system there, and they needed to be moved to a place to where they could be used. The other aspect, we're told, is that there were vast labor shortages across the Midwest and in other states. And we see these images which show this being a very successful program and everyone benefited from it. The families or the businesses looking to put children to work, and the children were given a place to live, potentially a family, and 3 square meals a day, and a roof over their head. But was it really that benevolent? Was that really the intention behind it? We see these images, and we remember how images can tell a different narrative than what the story that we're given is. We have to wonder, is there something much more insidious behind all this? The question I have is, if there was such a labor shortage across these states, and we'll take a look at a map here in a moment, then why did they need children to fill these labor shortages? Even if your only goal was simply to provide labor and provide efficient labor, it would certainly make more sense to have adults. And I'm told by numerous viewers that there were many people who simply had to work or they would die. And that's why there were so many laborers to do construction jobs. Well, what about agriculture? Isn't it also important to provide food to feed people? They seem to overlook that little fact that they claim there were labor shortages in the Midwest. Labor shortages that can only be filled by children. Interestingly enough, and not just in the farm fields, but in the mills and the plants and whatever baseline manufacturing that we had at that time. A lot of these images are considered shocking today. Of course, there's also the more benign aspect of growing up on a farm and you're part of a family and you work on a farm. Is it really terrifying labor, or are you just doing your chores and you're learning responsibility? It's true. However, you look at this from a grander perspective and you realize this goes beyond the simple concepts of child labor. You see that what's really happening is these children did have families. And we also find instances where there were multiple phases of the orphan trains. The initial orphan trains that ran in 1850 through 1870 seemed to be taking care of the kids that no longer had any parents. And after that, we saw repeat occurrences of the orphan trains, where there are many accounts that one of the parents were still alive. Whether it was the mother or the father, it doesn't matter. And the account we're given is that the mother or father, for some reason, was incapacitated and therefore the children had to be taken and sent to another family. And if you think about this, and if you think about why this effort would continue, this is where the true insidious nature of the orphan trains is revealed. This is how we destroy a people from establishing an identity and their own individuality. And you'll find plenty of accounts, especially on public broadcasting service or public television, where they talk about how benign and altruistic the orphan trains were and how effective they were. They even have people that they interview who were actual members of the orphan trains, or those who rode the orphan trains, as they euphemistically say, and that they ended up with a good family, that they felt that they benefited from the situation. Even more interesting is that most of the people they interview claim that one of their birth parents were still alive, and yet for various reasons they had to leave. They were alcoholic, or they were suffering from some sort of depression, or there was some other reason. A lot of times, though, when you try to look up the accounts, there was no reason given for why the children were taken from their parents. And remember, this was in the later decades, 1850 to 1870. It seems pretty clear there were a lot of children who simply didn't have parents. But then after that, they seem to repeat the concept of the orphan train as a means of taking children from their parents. It's a theme that appears and reappears in our historical narrative, and it's a disturbing theme because it does contribute to the concepts of diaspora and dysphoria. It prevents people from forming the ability to establish their own identity, and it makes them even more reliant on indoctrination. And if you think about this, you see how effective this is as a tool of indoctrination. Because until these children were given families, they were also kept together. And we think about many of the great schools that children were taken to. We also think about some of the schools that we looked at in our earlier explorations, such as St. Coletta. And we have to wonder if they had a different purpose. Everything, we're told, started in New York, and specifically New York City. This is where all these orphans seemed to be in a vast number. Why just New York City? Or was it because New York City was simply the collection point for all of them? If you think about it, it's a major port, and towards the end of the Civil War and the other conflicts, it would make sense to have the children as orphans go there. And then they were transported to these states, namely the Midwest states, to supposedly work on the farm where there was a shortage of labor. But none of the people who were looking for jobs decided to go out to the Midwest. They just wanted to work as construction workers. I'm being a little facetious, but I'm also being serious at the same time, because this doesn't make any sense. It also doesn't make any sense from the aspect as to why the Midwest would seem underpopulated. We're told it's because it was settled, but then at the same time we see all these towns and all these cities that seem to come up from nowhere. Each of the states of the Midwest also has their own account of the orphan trains, and of course, it's always supporting the narrative that this was a benevolent effort, that this was very altruistic, and this helped the children. And yes, I keep using that word altruistic because if we think about the grander aim of this, and the fact that we're told to think a certain way about this, we have to wonder, what's the true objective? And why was this something that was turned to again and again? Especially when we have numerous accounts of families who still had a parent that seemed to be perfectly capable of taking care of their children. This is also reflected more recently in the mainstream. There was a movie from 1979 called The Orphan Train, which you can still watch today, featured Glenn Close, and it was also featured on the very popular 1990s TV show, I'm not knocking it, Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, a show that was carried entirely by the charisma of Jane Seymour. And the episode, in fact, was called The Orphan Train, where a group of orphans showed up in Colorado. No, not one of the states, but everything seemed to happen in Colorado if you ever saw that show. And Dr. Quinn decides to team up with the local reverend, and they're going to raise the children, and there goes the plot. Of course, it's resolved within 60 minutes, like many other TV shows. The real point behind this is the fact that you have this concept of the orphan train remaining within the memory of the United States. And yet it's pushed again that this was a very benevolent effort, that we were legitimately trying to help these children. And yet you see other accounts that conflict with that. And I'll start with the story of my great-grandparents. These are the photos from my family, my great-grandparents. the family that originally lived in Cincinnati from 1890 to 1910. Looking at old photos is always very intriguing because they tell a different story. The actual account that I have from my great-grandparents, though, is very difficult to ascertain. And you look at these old photos and sometimes it just makes you feel like you're in a completely different world, as though you're looking at people with familiar faces, and yet the world they're living in just seems very different. This wasn't that long ago. Over 120 years, 130 years at most in some of the photos. And I just wanted to show you what these original photos looked like. This is the photo of my great-grandparents at their wedding ceremony. And they were very happy, according to what accounts that we have, although it's very difficult. And I'll explain why in a moment, why it's difficult to ascertain what truly happened. There was only a few surviving family members that actually made it to the generation, or 2 generations before mine, my grandparents. And there was quite a tragedy that occurred. From what I understand, when they were married, they were very happy, and they were prepared to take their place in life, and they lived in Cincinnati initially. And also the stories that my great-grandfather, pictured on the left here, was a very adventurous individual, and he was someone who had a very keen intellect and wanted to find answers in his life. Apparently he was someone who didn't necessarily accept the answers that he was given by others, and searched on his own. There's accounts of them going to several different World's Fairs or World's Expositions, to include the Chicago World's Fair, the Cincinnati World's Fair, and finally the St. Louis World's Fair in the early 20th century. However, the records are very difficult, and it's hard to say exactly what happened. They settled on a farm in Kentucky near Cincinnati, and that seemed to be where they lived and enjoyed their initial life. Initially, they had 3 children, and then it increased to 5 children as they were running the typical farm. Here's where the story starts to take an ominous turn. For reasons unknown, my great-grandmother suddenly died, and it's difficult to ascertain exactly why she died. There's nothing stating sickness. There's rumors of post-childbirth difficulties and the usual health aspects of that time. But nobody seems to know for sure, and there's no written account or anything in the news that survived to this day that tells me exactly what happened. The story gets even stranger when the fact that my great-grandfather, an adventurous individual and someone who was reputed to be very reliable, and most of the members of my family, if not all, and all the descendants from this branch of the family, they were all about family, and all about going the extra distance to take care of family. Yet for some reason, my great-grandfather had all of his children taken away from him. There was nothing ever stated on an official reason for why this happened, why he would be unable to care for them, or why he'd be unable to move on. Subsequently, he was confined to the Central State Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, where he spent the last 3 decades of his life. These were the last pictures that were taken of him, and this is from the 1940s. I can't get an exact date on the photo. And it was supposedly from the time that my grandmother was able to visit him and took these photos, and you actually see Central State Hospital right behind him here. I do look at his face, and I see that he seems to be content or at ease. And there was once a letter that he had written to his children, and yet I can't find that letter. I only have memories of it from my grandmother and her surviving sisters, and most of them have passed away now. Still, I wonder, why were his children taken away? What really happened? I only have more questions than answers. And that was the unfortunate tragedy of how his life ended, and how my grandmother and her sisters were put on a later version of the orphan train. The other thing that I found going through the photos was this strange postcard of the concourse at the Union Terminal in Cincinnati. You might recall it's the building we looked at in the exploration of Cincinnati that clearly inspired the Justice League building from the old Super Friends in the 1970s. Curious that this would be found in the effects that remained from my great-grandfather. This structure was not completed until the 1930s, And he was detained, and I'm going to use that word, in Central State Hospital in Louisville long before that. So why was there a postcard like this within his effects? It may not mean anything, but I have to wonder, is there some sort of clue about this? There's nothing that remains of his writings or his journals or even the letter that he wrote to his children after he was sent to Central State Hospital. So all I have to go on are clues, and I'm going to continue these explorations to try to find my own answers, because I feel there are many questions. We're also going to be looking more at the orphan trains, specific examples, and what effects they may have had from 1850 to 1870, and then their continuation in the 20th century. There's much more to explore with this, and yet it's clear we can see that this approach is still used even to this day with conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. It seems to be the way that people are kept in line, and that people are not only given activities which they must focus on, but also... Welcome to the Restituto Orbis channel, and today we're going to be exploring death shrines, or the concept of the ossuary. And as we fly over this very famous and well-known ossuary in France that commemorates the Battle of Verdun, the meat grinder battle from World War I, where over 100,000 French and German soldiers met their untimely demise, we think of the fact that there seems to be a lot of respect that's given towards the interment of these remains of all these unfortunate soldiers who died in these infinite frontal assaults that occurred for an entire year. And yet there is more of a story behind these ossuaries, and an ossuary is simply a structure where bones are stored, and we'd like to think that bones are stored in a very respectful manner. And indeed, as we look at this World War I monument, ossuary, cemetery, we can see that the greatest respect is given to soldiers who died in battle. And yet I use the concept of ossuaries as evidence for our reset theory, the reset war that occurred between the 4th and 5th era and our 5 eras theory. Now, the intention of this exploration is to show that hard evidence, and believe me, there is hard evidence to be seen. And we'll start at Kutna Hora in the Czech Republic, population 21,417. Rather modest population, especially when we've considered how populations have exploded in certain places, such as Seattle, where we had over 200,000% growth in a 100-year period. So it's quite amazing to see a town or small city in the Czech Republic where there's only 21,000 people and not 5 billion or 5 trillion. And I'm being serious. It's in this very modest town, though, that we're going to come across our first ossuary. And it's simply a chapel where bones are stored. And in this town, we even have another one of these very intriguing plague columns, because we just can't get enough of these plague columns. Again, another interesting reminder of what we have, that we supposedly survived a terrifying plague, so we decided to build a monument or memorial to it, and it's a column. There's even a smaller one that's closer to our building or chapel of interest here in this small city in the Czech Republic. What do these always truly reflect, though? We always see so many interesting figures and different symbols on these plague columns, and we've seen those symbols before. Now we go to Sedlic Ossuary, which is in the town in the Czech Republic, where we're going to take a close look. Now, we're told that this is a chapel where remains have been stored. Now, historically, and I'm going to avoid a lot of the historical narrative because, quite frankly, I find it very absurd for all these locations we're looking at in this exploration, we're told that this was a highly desirable burial plot for people to be buried in the years from medieval times all the way until the present in the Czech Republic, or whatever nation or organization of empire it originally was. And the official story does tell us here that the reason that they have so many bodies in this particular little chapel is this was a highly desirable burial plot. So what they were doing is they would remove or exhume the bodies that were already buried there and simply pile up the bones in great bone pyramids. Well, eventually they brought along this individual, a gentleman by the name of F. Rindt. We don't really need to concern ourselves with his name because his biography is so shallow it's not even funny, and we can see that even these arrangement of bones here is very unfortunately and shabbily done. But when you look deeper in the structure, you can see that 40 to 70,000 sets of bones have been arranged in a very artistic manner, and supposedly Mr. Rindt, or whoever he really was the individual who was hired fortuitously in the 1800s to arrange these pyramid piles of bones in a very artistic format to decorate this chapel in a very macabre or macabre manner, whether you're using American or British English. Yes, I always find pronunciations funny. Now consider this. Why would this ever be acceptable? How could it have ever been acceptable for bodies to have been exhumed? And they even have a legend that it was a half-blind monk who went about the task of exhuming all these bodies, these 40 to 70,000 bodies. How could the church ever accept exhuming bodies? And then furthermore, how could anyone ever accept arranging these skulls in this very macabre display? There's something awfully disturbing about all this when we look at all these bones and the way they're arranged. Now, of course, we won't think twice of it because this is a very popular tourist attraction in the Czech Republic. It's a very unique site. Now, if you look past the bones, you can see some very elaborate architecture within this little chapel. And now you can see how it's been decorated in this very disturbing manner. Are we really to believe that this one individual in this one location did this? And perhaps you might be thinking this is simply something that happened in one random location and that this is not widespread. Who in their right mind would decorate a location with these bones in this very disturbing manner? Because as we can see, this is really a display. And what are you doing with a display of human bones? Well, many people have this, those who are into hunting, and I'm not judging people who are into hunting in this exploration, I'm just using it as an example. We display these things to show trophies, to show achievements. Now, of course, the historical account tells us that this was merely a work of art to do something with all these bones, instead of actually, burying them, as we'd like to think the major religions of our land tell us to. And yet we find them arranged in this very bizarre format. I don't know, it makes you wonder if this is where Alejandro Jodorowsky and the designers had for their aborted Dune movie in the 1970s when they were going to design House Harkonnen. And then, of course, H.R. Giger. You can see where a lot of nightmarish inspirations may have come from looking at these rooms and these locations in this so-called ossuary in the Czech Republic. Now, you might be surprised to know that this is most certainly not a one-off location. There are many locations across the land where we have the bones displayed in this very disturbing manner. Now, a lot of people say, oh, really, and you're simply being a killjoy. Why can't you just enjoy the artistic depiction of human bones? Because when I look at these bones, if these bones are indeed real, which we're assured that they are, and when I actually went to this location many years ago, the bones looked and seemed pretty real to me. I remember that every single set of bones, and is it really 40 to 70,000 or is it many more individuals? Every single set of bones did used to be a human being at one point in time. And so I remember that and I consider that, and I find that very odd that it would ever be acceptable to any sort of society or religion, no matter what the time frame, to arrange the bones in these very disturbing formats. To show these bones as some sort of disturbing work of art, and in a Catholic chapel, no less. At least that's what the official story tells us. And how could it have ever been acceptable to have all of these bones exhumed from their rightful burial plot, just because we're told that everybody else wanted to be buried there, and so they respected the wishes of the people who were going to be currently buried there? And of course the answer will be, it's simple economics. The church needed money, and therefore they accepted their money. You look at this building, though, and you can see that on the outside it does have some interesting touches of architecture, and certainly on the inside it does as well. But what was the original purpose behind the structure? And we've explored this concept before in one of the very early explorations on the channel with the arrangement of bones in the underworld horror concept. And what are we really looking at? I believe that we're looking at trophy displays. This is something to remind us that a group of people in the past were completely destroyed, annihilated, and this is all that's left of them. Their bones, arranged in a trophy formation representing works of art. It is disturbing, and at the same time I believe it's also disgusting to a great extent that this is allowed to persist. Now, would I go and visit this site and actually look at this? Sure, but I would also remember the fact that every single one of those skulls that you're looking at right now used to be a living human being. And we always have that age-old question, well, what about respecting the dead? What about respecting our cemeteries? How exactly is this showing respect? How exactly is a very disturbing sight like this to be accepted and tolerated in a society that's always telling us that we need to right wrongs and address injustices, and yet this is allowed to persist, and no one thinks twice of this. And you can see that as you look deeper within this structure, there are more elaborate arrangements. And I will say that whoever did arrange the skulls and the bones, they did put a lot of effort into it. And there's even a lot of effort that's being put into cleaning them and maintaining this sacred site. Indeed, Ewan McGregor and his friend Charlie Borman in Long Way Round actually visited this site. I had no idea that these two were good friends. Apparently they did numerous series such as this where they went riding on their motorcycles together. Would have thought that this is a place that they would visit. And I show this with image generation just to give you an idea of when you try to fit in factors and variables for describing a location such as the ossuary, this is what you come up with. It's very dark and depressing and very ominous and malevolent all at the same time. Now let's go to the Chapel of Bones in Portugal just to show you that there's not an isolated location. And once again on the exterior we see a very well developed structure with some portal windows and small pediments and classic decorations and very elaborate towers. Now of course the name says it all. What are we going to see in this one? And yet you can see that in the exterior they've put a lot of effort into the architecture. And Portugal always draws our attention for its very elaborate and well-constructed and designed buildings that completely defy the limitations of the time. And let's not forget we saw one of the most intact and complete star forts. And yet in this very aptly named Chapel of Bones we have another very macabre, going British English this time, depiction of skulls that are all arranged in some sort of format. Again reflecting what? Is this just supposed to be a collection of bones that's supposed to show our respect for all these unfortunate individuals? And again, I wonder how many individuals' bone sets are actually in this particular structure. Thousands, tens of thousands? I mean, we could guess, we could try to count, but I have a feeling that nobody has any idea how many actual bone sets are located in this Chapel of Bones. And once again, I pose the question, why is this even considered tolerable? Oh, and this little saying here saying that, yes, we're waiting for your bones, so come see the bones that are here now. Isn't that ominous in and of itself? Imagine you walk into this structure and you're not even terrified or concerned that perhaps one day it'll be your bones on display in a structure like this. But of course that's not the way we're supposed to think. We're just supposed to think that these were structures that were erected in the distant past, and even though there may be some terrifying depictions within them, this is merely to remind us that we all have mortality, and you should not be alarmed at the fact that we have bones that are displayed in a very unique way that seems to suggest some sort of trophy or great victory. And that's why I think that's a very disturbing aspect with all these different structures that we look at. Now, to be fair, there are certain structures, we'll look at one later, where we're told that that's indeed what they were. It was supposed to be a structure of victory. But it's very strange to me that these are official religious sites, and yet we have all these bones arranged in this manner. Again, thinking of all the effort that this took. This seems to depict some sort of warning, some sort of triumph, and never forget your mortality, and never forget the fact that this could happen to you one day, once you passed away. Now, normally I don't go down this dark line of thinking, but when I see structures such as this, and the fact that these are still standing to this day, and of course they're great tourist attractions, I have to pose those questions. I'm not someone who's just going to walk by this and say, look, there's a big pile of bones there. When are they going to film the next Dungeons & Dragons movie there? We can see Jeremy Irons chew up the scenery as there's bones of real human beings behind him. And yes, in that lovely movie, that is actually something that happened, although we're not going to hold that against Jeremy Irons. Apparently he had a house to pay for, so that's why he appeared in that movie. But on a more serious note, you can see in this particular chapel just how all these bones have been painstakingly arranged in the walls and the columns, and looking more closely at these unfortunate skulls that have actually been amalgamated into the wall. A wall of skulls. It's something that we'd expect to see in a horror film. Something that we'd expect to see that would convey terror in human beings along with a very ominous score. And yet not too far from the structure, you can find other great beautiful structures in Portugal, as we alluded to earlier, with very advanced architecture, and we're not too far from that beautiful star fort that we looked at that also had a similarly named star fort when we explored Mobile Bay. Now let's go to Skull Chapel in Poland. Well, isn't this interesting, looking at the exterior of this Skull Chapel in Poland, and, well, I guess I can say there's nothing to see here. So let's take another look at it. It's a very modest building on the outside, and just looking at it from this perspective, you probably wouldn't think too much of it. I mean, why would there be anything unique about this particular structure? Why would it actually get your attention if you're just going around Poland? And Poland is a very beautiful nation, as many are, but then you go on the inside and you can see the bizarre, macabre arrangement of skulls, bones, and yet done in an artistic format around a crucifix, no less. So what exactly is being conveyed here? Why do we have this strange fixation on depicting and displaying human remains in this way? We're taught that the major religions of the land now value the proper treatment of the dead, and even the older religions or belief systems involved immolation, or cremation as it were, although that's considered barbaric by some standards. Of course, any sort of thing can be considered barbaric, and what's really the meaning of that word? I'm not going to follow that one down, but when you look at these different structures and you consider how these skulls are depicted, you have to ask these questions because, again, there was a lot of effort that went into arranging all these bones and all these skulls to look like this. And I find it even more disturbing that this is done in buildings that we're told are religious. So again, this gives us more conflicting accounts. Do we have actual spiritual beliefs where we truly value the welfare of human beings? Or is that just something that we say and then we do something else, which is something we come across every day? And of course, you'll probably say, well, it's just a normal contradiction because that's how human beings are. Yes, human beings are supposed to reflect their spiritual strength, but then they're supposed to be reminded of their material mortality. And therefore, depicting bones like this in a painstaking manner, and just imagine all the effort that went into this, and even more strange, having all these bones arranged around these angelic figures. It's almost the true contradiction that you see in some of these structures. And yet I suspect that these structures remain, and keep in mind we've looked at catacombs before, and we will be looking at catacombs here in a little bit, but these are all structures that are above ground. And these are all chapels and ossuaries and what have you that are depicting bones in this way as a warning, as a reminder, as what happened to those who obviously were not to persist. Now let's go to the Paris catacombs where we have the remains of 6 million people. This is one of the many entryways, and you can see that there's a lot of unique aspects to Paris. Yes, we have Paris on the exploration list coming up pretty soon. And the catacombs of Paris are supposedly well documented and mapped, although I suspect that we probably haven't seen 5 to 10% of everything that's actually mapped. Who knows how extensive a lot of these catacombs actually are. But the Paris catacombs are extremely well known, and yet when you actually go around the catacombs, you see many bizarre displays within them. Odd models and odd mock-ups of strange structures. For some reason, this one reminds me of the structure at the end of the film The Ninth Gate, if you ever saw that one with Johnny Depp. And here we see the same arrangement of all these skulls and bones. Now keep in mind, we're informed that there's 6 million individuals whose sets of bones line these catacombs in Paris. But I wonder if that's not a vast underestimation of the actual number of bones. And yet you see other displays such as this that give you the impression there's something else going on in these catacombs, that there's some sort of very bizarre and horrific tale that's being conveyed. It's not just the arrangement of the bones, but it's almost as though this is a reminder of a previous civilization that was completely destroyed, and that every single individual in that civilization, we are now looking at their remains. At least those whose remains actually survive to this day, because if we look at some of the forces that we saw that were clearly applied on other remaining structures and what they did to them, we have to wonder what those same forces would have done to human bones. Would there even be anything left, or would it just simply be completely reduced to dust, or even less? And yet here in these Paris catacombs, you can see these strange arrangements of skulls and bones, and consider all the effort and time that was put into this. And of course, we'll have the usual hand-wave story that it was monks and it was members of the church trying to be respectful to all of these deceased individuals by arranging their bones in a format, and in a nice format and a pattern around a cross, such as we see in this image, because that's just completely normal. And indeed, all of us are certainly guilty, and yes, I'll use that word directly, of going around on trips, and I've done it myself. I'm not above it, and I'm not going to judge anybody else, but guilty of simply going through sites like this and not being fully aware of the implications of it. What does it really mean when you're going across bones like this? Now, we have some people, such as Native Americans, who are very expressive about how they respect their tombs, and we can certainly respect that. Yet in these catacombs in Paris, we supposedly have strange figures such as this, with this individual who seems to be passing through the wall. What exactly is this all about? Let me know what you think in the comments. But back to the topic of actual consideration for the dead, How can we say we have any consideration for them when we just simply walk through these catacombs and we treat it as a tourist attraction? Or we're on our motorcycle riding with our best friend and we stop in the Czech Republic to take a look at these arrangement of bones. Quick, pose for your picture, smile. Never mind the fact that you're lined up to 100, 200 people whose lives are not remembered. And I also find that rather disturbing when people want to tell me that our explorations don't respect the original builders of the buildings that we look at. But then those same people are all about gallivanting around these piles of bones and not thinking twice of it. And that's probably the most disturbing aspect of it all because, again, that's not necessarily something that you can hold individuals directly accountable for if they're not aware, because we have a society that says, yes, it's perfectly okay to go walking amongst these bones and posing with them for pictures and make sure that they're kept clean and they're kept in their proper formats and arrangements to show their artistic appeal. I'm just going to be very honest. I find the whole concept of bones being depicted like this for artistic appeal disturbing beyond the ability of words to convey. And I find it more disturbing that we continue to use these Paris catacombs as a tourist attraction and these other ossuaries that we've looked at as a tourist attraction. Let's take a look at Skull Tower in Serbia. Now, this is one of the bone monuments, or ossuaries as you will, that was originally supposedly constructed as a warning when the Ottomans had defeated a rebellious force of Serbians in the distant past, or whoever they were actually fighting, and the rebellious force decided not to surrender to the inevitable, and they allowed themselves to all be killed. So since they couldn't be impaled, as was the tradition at the time, the Ottoman commander simply decided to have their bones put in this rather bizarre tower. If that is indeed what happened, although I sincerely question all these accounts, because if they were already dead, what is this going to show and what's this going to prove? It's really strange. It seems to be yet another structure that matches the other structures that we've looked at, where once again we have skulls on display to remind us of human mortality. And it's also a very bizarre display that we could really say is simply a trophy. And that's really what I think we're looking at with all these ossuaries, these towers, these chapels. We're looking at a true commemoration of what remained of the previous civilization. We are looking at their remains in every single one of these. And maybe that's why it's more disturbing to me beyond any reason, is because these were once human beings that were probably the part, or at least the end, of a great civilization. And now their bones are displayed as trophies, a reminder of a civilization that was destroyed. Now, whether it destroyed itself or it was destroyed by external forces, or, as I suspect, a combination of both, it's very unfortunate that this is what's remembered of them. Because we can certainly determine that in our current society, if any other certain group of people that was defeated in a conflict in the past, anything from the 20th century, and they had their bones depicted like this, there would be quite a response to it. At least we'd like to think there would be. But I suppose for a lot of people, it's just what they're told to value and what they're told to be upset or concerned about in the day, in the moment. Because it's always interesting to me just how fluid it really is. And yet you can see and get the almost lifelike and disturbing quality just looking at these skulls. And who were these people exactly? And is this kept as a reminder to us to stay in line? Because just as we saw in the little chapel in Portugal. Welcome to the Restituto Orbis channel, and today we continue our exploration into the morbid concepts of death shrines and catacombs. Today we take our explorations to the New World, or the Americas as it's called, and regardless of which term we use, there's a dark, insidious secret hidden in the land here. Come join me. The pre-Columbian era is a hand-wave term used by historians to describe the entire period of the Americas prior to its discovery of Columbus, or by Columbus, in 1492. We have sites such as Machu Picchu depicted here, which show us great knowledge and construction capabilities and architectural prowess. And yet at the same time, we see that there are many different aspects of art and deep civilization. Now they have different names for the civilizations that existed in the Americas that persisted after Columbus discovered America, after that hand-wave period. And we're told that they were civilizations that were capable of great architectural achievements, and yet they were committed to the concept of human sacrifice. Unlike the human sacrifice that we saw in Europe, which they called the Inquisition. Of course, that was not sacrifice. Those were people who were judged against the goodwill of the church. Whatever the reasons, we have an account that these civilizations engaged in human sacrifice. Now, whatever the truth or fallacy behind them, we see many morbid concepts of people being taken away from their homes and killed, and the reason we're told they were killed is simply to appease the gods or the deities that the civilization worshipped. In many ways, it's actually quite similar to the Inquisition. Yet what's more alluring about the aspect of this in the Americas is the fact that it seems to be a little bit more prevalent in modern depictions, where we wanted to show the ritualistic killings, the sacrifices. Nobody refers to the Inquisition as this, and we have many images that show the implements, and we're told this was a ceremonial dagger that was used in this sacrifice. The actual existence of these civilizations, though, the Mayans, the Incans, and the others, the Cahokian civilization, they were capable of great architectural feats. And yet at the same time, we want to claim that they were also into this terrifying ritualistic sacrificial killing. Why is it that we always have these conflicted accounts of these civilizations? And this seems to be the real legacy of all the current era civilizations that we have, regardless of who they are. And we look at some of the strange art from the Mayans or the Aztecs, and oddly enough, we see this individual, we're told, lost their head, and yet now they have a head of snakes. Very interesting depictions, and are we to believe that this is what happened, or are we to consider that this is simply propaganda, if you will, a different story that was told by the conquistadors? And yes, let's not forget that we're told that a mere group of hundreds of Spaniards managed to conquer empires of over millions who were capable of these architectural achievements. Something is not adding up here. But the reason I preface this particular exploration with this consideration of the Mayans, the Incans, and the Aztecs is we're told these were the civilizations that existed after Columbus discovered America, and they were subsequently destroyed. We also have this interesting little depiction of what's supposed to be modern art depicting what was Mayan art that was composed in 2014. And I merely show this to give you the example that our modern artists can reflect this. And now we go to the Basilica and Convent of San Francisco, Lima, Peru, supposedly built in 1672, but who knows for sure. A very intriguing structure that once again reflects many of the wondrous cathedrals and basilicas that we've seen across Europe. But this is in the New World in Lima, Peru. And what exactly does this reflect when we look closer at this structure? We can see the fine detailing of architecture, and this matches many of the great structures that we've looked at in Europe, exclusively Portugal and Spain, and we're told that they had all the time in the world to complete those constructions there. But in the 1600s, not too long after this land was discovered with all these great challenges, we're to believe that these civilizations of Spain and Portugal managed these wondrous achievements, building the exact same structures. And of course, with the policy of encomienda, or in simple summarized terms, forced labor that was imposed on the natives that they encountered, many died to erect these structures. And yet somehow in some way these conquistadors and their descendants, who were told wore iron armor in very difficult conditions, they managed to pull off these architectural achievements. And yet in this convent, this basilica, there is a much darker story. As much as we have with many of the isolated locations in Europe, we have an account of catacombs here. But we have to define and understand the difference between catacombs and death shrines. We also have some interesting architecture when it comes to the walkway. How old are these blocks, and how are they set in there so finely? How is it holding up so well after all these years? The interior of this basilica and this convent is no less impressive. Very advanced construction techniques with fine geometric precision and many different arches. The same signs that we've seen in structures across the land. So while we have the account that the quote-unquote New World was discovered later, and had a different form of civilization imposed on it according to the official history, we still see tremendous architectural achievements. And perhaps what we're really looking at with the Mayans, the Incans, and the Aztecs and their architectural achievements are indeed something from a previous era even that somehow managed to survive. Or maybe what we were seeing was the very height of the previous civilization. The same peoples, but who do we actually give credit for who accomplished these structures? What we do know is that they're still standing, and they definitely point to a grandeur that we don't expect the people of this time to be capable of. If the Spaniards and the Portuguese were limited to simple horsepower and simply trying to survive after conquering these mighty empires, then why didn't they simply repurpose the existing structures? Why would they bother building these newer structures, according to the same diagrams and plans that they had over in Europe? No, there's something much more to this story. And what seems to be a more plausible explanation is that we have, once again, the concept of civilizations building on top of other civilizations. But the timeline doesn't make sense that we're actually given. What would make more sense is if the history occurred as we're told for the Spanish and the Portuguese to simply repurpose the pyramids that they found, to simply repurpose the structures. We even have famous individuals that are allegedly buried at this convent, this basilica in San Francisco and Lima. But who exactly were they? Did these people really exist, or are these just merely idealized paintings to give us the idea that there were famous individuals, and to give us something to focus our efforts and research on, so we don't step back and look at the true account of San Francisco and Lima, Peru? Indeed, there seems to be something much more insidious behind this particular structure. And when we consider what it's really known for, we suddenly find another account of older diagrams that show us that the structure has been around. Was it really built in the 1600s? What actually was its construction date? Even the architectural style they tell us that it was inspired by is a conflicting account. But what is so incredible about this particular structure? We have what's very clearly a structure we'd expect to find in Europe, in Peru. And it does have catacombs. Now, to be specific, catacombs are where bodies are buried. It's quite as simple as that, and a catacomb itself does not necessarily reflect the death shrines that we looked at in the exploration last week. But as you poke around in these catacombs beneath this basilica and this convent, you find that there is a much more insidious account, and you'll find that there is indeed a death shrine in this catacomb, another artistic display and depiction of human bones. And many questions were asked in other explorations, including the one last week, about the origin of these bones. What kind of effort had to be put into actually creating this death shrine? These bones all had to be completely cleaned off of human flesh and the remnants of the deceased. And then they also had to be arranged in these very morbid displays. And again, who actually puts the time and effort to do this? And according to the official history, we have all these monks and these other individuals who devote their time and their effort to establish these. And even in more recent accounts, we just have random carpenters and artists with a more morbid styling who decided to arrange the skeletons and the remains of human beings from the past in this very morbid display. But once again, we know what we're looking at. We're looking at a display of human trophies that for whatever reason, the people of this civilization were exterminated. Now, in this particular account of South America in Peru, it would perhaps make more sense that the Spanish and or the Portuguese simply wish to display the remnants of the natives. The problem is we have the exact same thing being done over in Europe. And it's also in many other locations across the land where we have these very morbid human displays, or these human trophies. And even in this more insidious image where it looks as though these unfortunate individuals were put in some sort of close containment, and yet the bones were stacked. What exactly is going on with all this? Again, it seems to be a reflection, a warning of what happens to those who do not adhere to the authority and the power at the time. And whatever the actual account, I find it hard to believe that any sort of legitimate human religion would accept anybody stacking and displaying bones in this manner, in a very morbid and artistic display. And yet this is exactly what we have. And we do see this in many other forms of fiction, where the stacking of bones in this manner is considered very inhuman. It's considered something that is very disgusting and perverse. And yet I'm sure there's no shortage of individuals on social media who, if they see these sites, will simply ask you the question, well, what's strange about that? And to many people, they'll simply walk through on their little aspect of tourism and think that they're just in a nice structure, and that posing near bones and exploring catacombs and death shrines is nothing to even blink at. It's perfectly ordinary, and there's nothing strange about it. There's nothing strange about this elaborate arrangement of bones in this very morbid display to many people. Now, once again, I'm not judging anybody. I believe that a lot of people are simply told to simply overlook this. Focus on the great architecture that you see and realize that you have a wonderful historical site here. And yet, we have conflicting accounts about the morality of depicting bones. We're often told that Native American graves should be respected. So, whose bones are these in reality? And why do we have a conflicting account about some bones being respected and other bones not being respected? The deeper you go into this catacomb, this particular death shrine, you find more morbid displays. And this shows that in the New World, in the Americas, there are indeed death shrines. But what about in the United States? There are many catacombs in the United States, more than are generally known, but there are no actual death shrines. In other words, there's no bodies that are really displayed anymore. But we have no shortage of what we're told are catacombs. Now, a lot of times we could explain them as simply being tunnels. We have tunnels under every major city in the United States. And indeed, virtually every capital complex of a state capital, every federal building, every star fort has a very intricate and well-documented, I love using those terminologies, network of catacombs that run underneath them. Now, oftentimes they'll tell us it's merely an underground city. We have underground cities in Seattle, Atlanta, and many other locations that we've explored in the past. And yet at the same time, they do officially acknowledge that these are catacombs. You can take a tour of the catacombs underneath New York City, and you can find other connecting tunnels. But it begs the question, why are there no bodies? Why are there no death shrines? The official explanation will be given is that because the United States is so new, apparently a little newer than what we just looked at down in South America, that they didn't prefer to use catacombs, even though we're then told in a conflicting account that, yes, these are catacombs. These are supposedly tunnels that are underneath the Iowa State Capitol. I can confirm that there's some of them. And if you look in the account of Des Moines, the capital of the state of Iowa, there are numerous rumors and indications of a vast series of catacombs that were found off of the riverbed. But good luck trying to document that or find anybody that'll corroborate that now. But whether the catacombs in Des Moines existed or not, we do have an account of many other catacombs under many other major cities that still exist to this day. And indeed, we did explore some of the catacombs underneath Indianapolis and Tomlinson Hall, where we had that lovely story of that pigeon that dropped a cigarette and that caused Tomlinson Hall to burn to the ground. Fortunately, the structure and the catacombs beneath were unaffected by the fire, so it seems as though there is a location that could survive a fire. But you can find many different, interesting aspects of infrastructure that still exist to this day that give you the perception and the indication that there were indeed vast catacombs, and catacombs that were larger even than the ones we looked at in Paris. And here, looking at the imagery of Tomlinson Hall, we're supposed to believe that this structure simply was burned down. Yes, of course, because the fine pillars of the structure were actually made of wood, and there are many people that simply accept that explanation. I do not. I find it rather absurd, but everyone can come to their own conclusions. I'm simply presenting what we're told and what we see with Tomlinson Hall in Indianapolis. And the reason that this comes to mind is that because of the fact that once Tomlinson Hall burned down, the only thing that's left underneath it are the catacombs. No bodies to be found. But you'll have conflicting accounts on that. There are bodies that are actually hidden beneath the catacombs in Indianapolis. There are other morbid displays that are still alluded to. And interestingly enough, we do have conflicting accounts again from the United States within these catacombs. Was this merely a foundation? Was this a tunnel system? Was this some remnant of the previous civilization that survived? Or could there be a much more insidious explanation for why we find no death shrines or displays of bodies within these vast catacombs? It's very strange that we're told these are catacombs, though. So it's as though someone wants to give us the impression that, yes, death did occur in the United States, but it's simply explained by the fact that this was how they decided to dispose of remains. And in the United States, we're told that they have a much more greater focus on having the dead buried above ground, or at least within the ground, and then within crypts that are above ground. But then at the same time, everywhere you go, you'll find these tunnel systems. You'll find these crypts that are underground, within the ground. You'll find the remains of great underground cities beneath the aforementioned Seattle and Atlanta. So it seems to be conflicting accounts. It's as though we're supposed to be confused about what's really going on in these catacombs. And yet we find one of the most alluring and insidious mysteries so far that we've come across in this alternative research that we've done on this channel. It seems as though these catacombs are more extensive, but no death shrines. Why? Perhaps it's because we weren't supposed to ever see the remains of the human beings that were actually in these catacombs. And whatever bodies that we have in them now are something that have been placed there more recently. And why is that? What is the alluring mystery behind why we were not supposed to see the bones within these particular catacombs? We have many different conflicting accounts in the past of different types of human beings that resided specifically in what is today the United States, Canada, and northern Mexico. Now, can we be certain as to the geographic range of these different types of human beings, or is this just a legend, a myth, or a rumor? All could be true, but we do have numerous clues and numerous indications. There's also extensive cave systems that are more extensive in the United States than in many other locations. Again, even in Iowa, we have a very vast cave network, the Macabre Caves, but it's not just Iowa. You can go to Missouri, you can go to New Mexico, you can go to Kentucky, and you'll find some of the largest cave systems in the known land. And oddly enough, many of these cave systems are well developed, with developed concrete walks in them that we're supposed to believe were constructed by the WPA in the United States because there was nothing better to do during the Great Depression, or whatever silly account we have of how the infrastructure within these caves or these tunnels was actually established. And yet it points to something that's being kept from us. It points to an insidious secret that we're not supposed to know. What happened to the bodies in these catacombs? There was a reason not to display the bones in the death shrines in the United States. It seems as though we weren't supposed to see them. And why is that? Because if we actually saw the remains of these human beings, or perhaps this entirely different group of human beings, we might have uncomfortable questions about it. It might not be so easy to explain. For example, we have the well-documented concept of elongated skulls. Now, there are many different explanations that are given to us about why some human beings have elongated skulls, and yet in many different artwork and many different depictions from different civilizations, we do see the concept of the elongated skull. We also see the concept of a variance in scale. Now again, you'll simply be told that these are merely children and this is an idealized image. Yes, an idealized image with this fine geographical precision and depiction on it. But yet you'll find many different scaling within the beings. It indicates that either there were giants in the past, or there were very, very small people in the past, or both and all the above. You'll find that it's very well documented that there are elongated skulls everywhere you look. And there's explanations for it. Like I've said, it was simply a mark of society. It was something that was imposed on the people to give them that sign of nobility, or you'll have other explanations. It was some sort of genetic abnormality. Just look to the science and it will come up with any great explanation. It sort of reminds me of how they look to the science to provide technobabble to get themselves out of any difficult situation in the more recent Star Trek series. But it seems to be that there are more documented cases that we just simply can't ignore. And there are multiple sources and multiple indications, not just from our current mainstream science, but also from our religious texts and other histories that we have, that give us the indication that there were different sorts of beings in the past. And it's not something that we can ignore. And so if we take that conclusion and we apply it to why we have vast empty catacombs in the United States, then suddenly we have to consider the question, along with all the rumors that we have, were there different sorts of beings in the distant past that were in these catacombs? Or is it some other conclusion? Is it some other secret that there was something terrible that happened to these beings in the United States? Why is there something that seems to come up about our focus on the United States? Is it because the particular geographical area has different rumors associated with it? Or is it because that in the plan for the layout of the civilization of the Fifth Era, our current era, there was a special purpose behind the United States? What's the United States tend to be used as right now? Well, it is the primary military power in the current world or order of the land. But why are there so many strange secrets? Why is it we have all these expectations and perceptions in the United States about the limitations of building capabilities, the rapid rise of the civilization, and then of course back to the catacombs? There's also the rumor of giant sets of bones in many different locations across the United States. And while we've only touched on the concept of giant human beings, there are rumors. Now, oftentimes they're dismissed, and the very same scientific figures of authority will tell us that it's simply impossible. It is physically impossible for large human beings to exist in the past. But 65 million years ago, it was completely possible for megafauna such as dinosaurs to exist and roam the land. It was a very different environment, and that may all be true. But why do we have all these different examples in many different sources that depict completely different kinds of human beings? It seems to be there's more to this, and we can also point to a discovery in Atacama of the Atacama skeleton in a desert in Chile. And you can see the actual size on this in this particular image, and the official scientific explanation behind this small skeleton that was found by a Spanish businessman is that it was merely a human fetus that had some deformities, although there are other examples of this very small skeleton that exist. Now, you can certainly accept the scientific explanation that that's exactly what this is. This was an unfortunate human fetus that was mummified, and maybe we're not even looking at the real, actual, authentic skeleton. We just don't know. I mean, I can certainly assure you I do not have this artifact sitting in my house right now, but it's something to consider when we have official accounts that tell us that this does exist, and this was analyzed by the forces of science, and they tell us that this is an aborted fetus. So be it. Or not an aborted fetus, but a mummified fetus. But when you look at it, it definitely gives you indications that something else may have happened. And this is just another example of the conflicting accounts that we have of different types of human beings. And indeed, if there were different types of human beings in those vast catacombs across the United States, and their bones all had to be removed or destroyed, imagine the effort it had to take to remove the flesh and arrange all these bones. Now imagine the effort it would have taken to remove all the bones completely. We suspect that there was technology available that could completely destroy the buildings and render them into dust. Was there also a technology that could also render the bones into dust? You look at the different examples of the possibilities of different types of human beings, and you look at the many scientific explanations, the technobabble explanations, or whatever you want to call it, that gives us the actual result for this. And yet we see too many similar and repeating themes across the land, regardless of the official historical account we have. So what's the final explanation? Are there really human beings? Is there something else out there? Or is there something more? That's something that we have to consider, and it's something that we have to constantly be aware of with what we have available. The U.S. prefers cemeteries, and we consider the vast accounts of many different U.S. cemeteries that are across the land, and even the asylums. The asylums themselves have many great cemeteries, and at the same time, we're given different reports that they buried many bodies in each of these grave markers. There could be anywhere from 20 to 30 bodies in each of these particular markers. It's very morbid. In some locations, they even use these little coins. So how many people were sent to these asylums, and how did they meet their untimely demise, and what happened to their remains once they did die? We even have accounts from the United States Civil War of vast amounts of deceased soldiers who were buried in mass graves, but then we're also told that they were exhumed and then reburied in individual graves. It's very strange. It's very strange that we have all these accounts of these cemeteries in the United States and conflicting accounts of this in catacombs. So indeed, we have to consider the overall number, the population, how many people actually perished in each of these asylums. But then there gets to be a little bit of a darker clue with all this, the real dark secret behind the Americas of the New World. The asylums were everywhere across the land, but what was their original function? What was their original intention and purpose? Were these originally concentration camps, as we see them, a place to send people who weren't going to integrate in the new society, the order that had arisen in the current civilization, one that had overthrown the previous civilization, and that these were merely places to send those who would not integrate into the new society, for them to be isolated and then eventually removed in any way, shape, or form, whether that was through a physical death or whether that was through torment and other terrifying things. There's a reason why we have such a terrifying legacy with the asylums. And yet at the same time, when we step far enough back and we look at the asylums and we look at other sorts of institutions, we can see many commonalities with the way they're laid out. Indeed, we know what these asylums really are. They're actually compounds, a series of buildings that all seem to have similar functions. And when we consider those compounds, perhaps they had a very different function, something that points back to the previous civilization, compounds that were established by the Fourth Era civilization, as we call it on this channel, to attempt to survive the reset. But perhaps the most intricate clue that we have is the fact that we do have this account of many bodies being buried in these compounds, in these asylums. And it's indeed this clue right here that tells us that there's something that we need to examine within these asylums, where we'll continue to unlock the mysteries as we try to understand and piece together the real account of what happened from the Fourth Era civilization to the Fifth Era civilization. I always consider that it's possible that the actual history that we've been given is true. However, with each successive exploration, I continue to find that to be less and less likely. The compounds of the soldier homes. Now, these were also called soldier asylums. This was a place for soldiers after the Civil War to go and essentially live out their lives. And you'll see, looking at actual footage, that these are wondrous structures, and they match many of the asylums. But would you be surprised to know that the compound layout of all the asylums, all the hospitals, and even the great public institutions of the United States are all very similar? It seems to me that these reflect a reset compound, a survival compound that was reused and changed. What are your thoughts on this? Thank you for joining me. We'll continue these explorations. Please like, comment, and subscribe.